Remember that the president had many audiences that he had to deal with. The international audience was principally my responsibility, but he had an outraged population. He had 300 million Americans who saw what happened to thousands of their fellow citizens, and we didn't know what else might be coming. So we had to make sure there was not another attack. But I think the president's choice of words were necessary for that moment, to tell the American people that this is an attack that almost rises to the level of World War II in Pearl Harbor, and to mobilize them to go after this enemy as if it was a war like World War II. So I don't object to that language. The word crusade was used once, then we realized, let's not do that one again, because it just creates the wrong kind of imagery in that part of the world. It was not a good choice of words, but it was not used again.
Pretty soon the US started to take military action in Afghanistan against the Taliban regime. And it was crafted as a very surgical type of campaign with a very small number of people on the ground. They talked about light footprint and all these terms. But then today we see 100,000 US troops still there. Would you have conceived back then that we'd be here 10 years later with such a large number of American troops committed there?
I wouldn't have conceived it back in the fall of 2001 when we had this exciting action of very sophisticated U.S. technology and special forces married up with people riding horses. I mean, it was the 10th century married to the 21st century, and it worked. But the Taliban turned out to be much more resilient, and al-Qaeda much more persistent in its presence than I think anyone had anticipated back then.
The invasion of Iraq was clearly a much more controversial episode, certainly in Europe. Do you, though, still believe that the invasion and the war was justified in the broader sense?
Well, I think we can't yet make a determination of that. History will make the final determination. And I'm not ducking the question, but think of it this way. A terrible dictator is gone. More than that, a terrible dictatorial regime is gone. Saddam Hussein is no more. Whatever concerns we may have had about weapons of mass destruction from a regime that had them in the past, had used them in the past, and there was no guarantee they would not make them in the future and use them in the future if they got out of sanctions. We don't have to worry about that ever again. What we're looking at now is, will the Iraqis succeed in putting together a government that is responsive to all of the people of Iraq, that takes into account the differences in Iraq, that is not under the thumb of any outside power, even though it may have good relations with outside powers. They are independent and free. And will they be able to build a thriving economy that serves the needs of its people? That's what we're waiting to see. And I think the potential is there for that to take place, for that to emerge. And if that does, then I think one can say, yes, it was worth it.
It sounds, though, that like you're worried that at this late stage, with that heavy investment of life and treasure, that the Iraqi government might veer towards Iran?
I didn't say that.
Well, you mentioned an outside power.
Yes, and I'm saying to make sure that that doesn't happen. I'm not saying it's going to happen.
Concerned. I didn't say. I said it sounds like you're concerned
I didn't say it was going to veer toward that. What I think I said was that we want to make sure that a political and economic system emerges and a government emerges that is not under the thumb of an outside power.
Iran.
Iran. Yes, Iran is the number one country I would be concerned about. But I didn't say it was going to be under the thumb of Iran.
It's a risk. Yeah. It's a risk in your view. Do you think American tanks riding into Baghdad in that extraordinary way hastened the Arab Spring, had no effect on it, slowed it down?
I think it should have been a sobering moment for all of the other nations in the region who were under single-person leadership and had been for years, and did not have the opportunity to elect their own leaders. And so to some extent, I think it might have had an effect like that.
Do you think the US is playing it about right currently with the Arab Spring? Do you think in situations like Syria there should be a stronger lead from the US? How do you see the coming months developing on this?
There are still unknowns out there as to how the Arab Spring will play out, and will play out differently in every single one of these countries. Syria, you have a dictator who has the example of his father before him and is being extremely vicious with respect to the protesters. and the demonstrators. And it remains to be seen how that's going to play out. I think the United States and the international community, the United Kingdom and the United Nations, can apply more sanctions, but I don't sense, from my perspective, that there is any inclination of sending in military force, for example. Use sanctions, use other methods to try to bring pressure on the Syrian regime, on President Assad, to realize that this isn't going anywhere for you. Sooner or later, you will find that these people cannot be held down forever.
The economy is very much front and centre now for most Americans. Do you think with the 10th anniversary of 9/11, perhaps this is a moment where the page can be turned to some extent and the nation refocused on the economic priority?
Well, I think the nation has been refocused on the economic problems for the last several years. I mean, everybody knows that the real strength in this world comes from a strong economy that's creating jobs for your people. So we are increasingly focusing on domestic issues here in the United States. And this will not cause us to ignore the lessons of 9/11. We're not suddenly going to stop worrying about terrorists, start thinking that Al-Qaeda is totally defeated. It has been badly damaged, but we have to remain on guard against the possibility of another terrorist attack, even while we're fixing our economy.
But presumably the US would have weathered the financial crisis much more easily if it hadn't spent trillions on those wars.
We had to deal with Afghanistan. That's where we were attacked from by Al-Qaeda. And one can argue as to whether or not we had to deal with Iraq or not. It would have been easy for Saddam Hussein to have avoided what happened to him. And that might not have been a good thing for the world, but he could have avoided it. We worked hard, and I worked hard, persuade my leadership that we ought to take it to the UN and see if a war could be avoided, because there's always unknown consequences of a conflict. But he didn't take the get-out-of-jail card we gave him. The president decided on a war as being necessary. I fully supported him. I went to the UN to make the case, fully supported him from there on in.
Bin Laden is dead. The US faces these crises, challenges in the region that we talked about, the Arab Spring, Iran. Is there some sense, though, in which the fact that the US ran up such huge costs in these conflicts, a thing that gives him the last laugh in some awful way?
You think Osama bin Laden is laughing somewhere?
I just wonder whether the fact the US is in such a difficult economic position cannot contemplate engaging more fully now in the Middle East or against Iran.
This is your judgment. You're making these judgments, but they're not my judgments.
Sure.
My judgment is that you are selling the United States short. We have incredible wealth in this country. It's just a matter of tapping into it appropriately, making sure that we're investing in the right things. And we can do all of those things to put us back on a sound financial footing and show the rest of the world that we still are a model and inspiration to the rest of the world. And we can also deal with the challenges that might emerge from Iran and North Korea and places like that. The Iranians are going to face the same pressures that all of the other countries in the region have faced. I once asked the Iranian foreign minister on one occasion we had to chat with each other. I said, what's your number one problem in Iran? Trying to give him a nice, easy question that gets neither of us in trouble. And without hesitating in the slightest, he said, we have to create 600,000 jobs a year. He didn't say anything about we got to finish our nuclear program. We got to create 600,000 jobs a year. They have a young, growing population that needs jobs. And ultimately, those kinds of pressures will force changes in Iran that perhaps nobody is prepared to anticipate now, but will happen. I think these are historic forces at work, and Iran will not be immune from these forces. And I can assure you that the United States will be playing a role as this world emerges.
General Powell, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Colin Powell talking to our diplomatic editor Mark Urban earlier today.